I don't think anyone in the world knows that Meghan Markle has eaten Jack in the Box and loves it.
It's so funny, too, that you keep saying Meghan Markle. You know I'm Sussex now. You have kids, and you go, no, I share my name with my children.
Yes.
And that feels so, I didn't know how meaningful it would be to me, but it just means so much to go, this is our family name, our little family name.
Well, now I know, and I love it.
This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Lilah Raptopolous. I'm a culture journalist at the Financial Times. I'm the U.S. editor of FT Globetrotter. We publish cultural guides to cities around the world. And I have a special interest in how cultural memory gets passed down through taste and through food.
We should also note that you were our co-host on one of our most popular episodes. If people haven't listened to it yet, it's all about recipes, the problem of too many recipes, but also passing down recipes. It's such like a broad, expansive topic that we somehow managed to like get really fantastic questions about, and people just love this episode. So that's part of the reason we wanted you to come back. Also, you had been posting a lot on your Instagram about watching
With Love Meghan, yes.
Meghan. So we're talking about the show today. It's a cooking show / crafting show / aspirational lifestyle / we want to know something about the woman who is married into the royal family. And we decided to do the show because you were posting about it in your Instagram stories, but also you were getting a ton of responses from other people who were also watching it.
Yes.
And what were the takes that you were hearing from other people?
Great question. First of all, I'm so thrilled to be back to be talking about this. I have so many thoughts about it. And you know when you have so many thoughts about it that you want to like say them all at the same time, and you also kind of want to lie down. Like you just can't get it all out.
Yes.
And I don't even feel fully like I have it figured out yet. But yes, I started posting like, "Are you watching this?" on my Instagram stories, and I started getting a lot of responses, and a lot of them were like personal, to be honest, about her. Something about her was really bothering people. Something about she seemed disingenuous. She seemed fake. It didn't seem deep enough. Like there's something there. And that like always, I felt it too, but it always rubs me a little the wrong way to just be talking ish about women, although there's something behind it.
And especially someone like Meghan, who I think like, and it's very important for us to acknowledge this, like so much of the criticism of her, which discourse around her really varies according to location.
Right.
Like I think a lot of people might not know that the conversation about her like is very different in the US than it is in Canada, than it is in the UK.
Definitely in the UK, it's very toxic.
Yeah. And it is absolutely shot through with racism.
Totally.
And also like ideas about Britishness and all sorts of other things, right?
Yes.
And so we are not pretending like that does not exist. And we're going to return to that thought over and over again. But I think sometimes if someone starts to have a conversation about her and doesn't acknowledge from the top that this is like a really important part of her image that often gets ignored when people just are like, well, I don't like her.
I know.
Like, what is that about?
Right. As you're saying, like she's been through it often very unfairly. In the UK, she had like the British tabloids just spreading racist, misleading stories about her and her husband. And also like, you're right that in the UK, even the discourse about it still, it's so like pregnant with so many other things that in the US, it's just sort of like a novelty that it just feels lighter here. The conversation about it feels lighter here.
No, and like you cannot disarticulate a conversation about her from conversations about Princess Kate, right? Like there is this like very severe contrast that people use about like, okay, what kind of royal, like how have they cowed to the rules and the performance standards of the royalty? Like one seems to have been able to conform with much more ease. I wonder why that is.
Right.
And like as we talk about why Meghan is even doing this show, right? A lot with like that's always going to be couched in they severed ties with the royal family and moved to the United States and are no longer like performing as royals.
Yeah.
And why is that? Because the royal family was like endlessly shitty to them. Right.
Right, exactly.
So That is there.
That is there. Also, another thing that I think is there, which actually I'm curious for your thoughts on, because you were on my sort of late podcast I used to host when we talked about Katy Perry, is just this idea that, like, you know, we're both women that do our work publicly. I'm currently on your podcast. Like, I don't love to take great pleasure in, like, disliking women who are trying to be themselves in public. It's hard to be yourself in public, and they don't need to be doing it, and they're also doing it for all the people who are enjoying them. But that said, like, when we were talking about Katy Perry and, like, her sort of specific brand of annoying, you were sort of like, well, she's a celebrity. Like, we are allowed to critique her in some ways.
No, and she's putting herself out there for public consumption, and celebrities don't get to set the rules about, like, you are only allowed to say nice things about me. Right. And I think, as we'll see as this conversation unrolls, a lot of what we're going to talk about this show is about the style decisions of the show.
Mm-hmm.
I actually find Meghan quite likable.
Yeah.
Like, you can tell that there's a warmth at the heart of her.
Mm-hmm.
And how has this show managed to bungle that so severely? Like, and that's part of why I only wanted to do this show with someone who is not just, we weren't just going to talk about, like, what is the celebrity image of Meghan Markle? And we were going to talk about what is going on with this as a cooking show.
Yes. The majority of the responses that I was getting, just to kind of finish that point, was a mix of, I don't want to dislike her, but I'm really struggling.
Yes.
And I don't know how I feel about this, but it's driving me nuts. And I don't know why they're giving her such a hard time. That pasta recipe is really not that bad. Like, it was sort of a mix of those things. And I hate it, but I watched the whole thing. You know,
Right.
A lot of that.
Okay, let's get into the questions. This first one is going to get into the performance of race, wealth, gender, everything. It comes from Yael, and Melody's going to read it.
I'm so excited for you to talk about With Love, Meghan. I have so many thoughts and questions about the show. Number one, she obviously enjoys crafting, homemaking, cooking, etc., but to me, the vibe is off. Her body language seems quite tense, turned inward, and slightly uncomfortable. She also seems unable to have friendly banter or a real conversation where she has to express herself verbally in the moment comfortably. I know she's the executive producer, but why didn't anyone step in and tell her that she needed help in these areas? Is that even something that could be done? Number two, this is a lifestyle show where the average viewer is miles away from having the resources, like time and money, to achieve what Meghan is espousing. And there's been a lot of criticism of the show for being unrelatable, both in terms of the content, like having the time to make a balloon arch, and the setting, her designer beige clothes, the Montecito estate. On the other hand, what one person calls unrelatable, another calls aspirational, or even positive escapism, like watching a fantasy lifestyle for fun. For this genre, what specifically saves an unrelatable lifestyle show and makes it feel aspirational or escapist instead? What could have made Meghan's show better to get across those feelings?
Let's just start with the first part of the question. First of all, Yael, incredible questions.
Exceptional.
This, like, gets to everything. So
Truly.
the first part of the question, what did you make of this reading of the vibes?
Yeah. You know, the vibes are definitely off. And the response to that feels so overwhelming that it doesn't feel subjective. Like, it doesn't feel like, oh, some people feel that, like, she's a little off. Like, it really does feel like somehow in this show, she's being kind of bad on tape. It feels like no one helped her. It feels like the editing has made her sound almost like an AI character.
Yes.
It feels like when there's, like, a chance for depth, and we can talk more about this, but it just, like, it doesn't let her get there. And that feels off. And
I think it's actually the worst in the first episode.
Absolutely.
I don't know if Netflix did a traditional film the pilot and then take it to series, or, which is like what they would have done in network television, or if they made the order and then made all of them. But it has, like, extreme pilot vibes in terms of trying things out, trying to figure out, like, clearly everyone was doing this for the first time.
Absolutely.
They were like, I guess we'll have your makeup artist come and be your first guest. And there are a couple places where she talks sort of directly at the camera, but it's askance, and it has the effect of making her look almost cross-eyed, and she's not cross-eyed.
Right,
It's
right.
just like the way that they were filming it, and I think that then takes you out as a viewer. You're like, what? So does she acknowledge the camera people? Like, what's that voice that's sometimes off screen?
Mm-hmm.
Is the other executive producer a character in this show? Like the rules of the show and how it will work are not established.
That's
They're very
really true.
loosey-goosey. And I think they get a little bit more refined as the series goes on. I've admittedly only watched the first 4.
Mm-hmm.
But they still, I think, like, they don't know exactly what this show is other than it is a show with Meghan Markle.
Yes.
Right? And this is like a very Netflix problem where
Yes.
they're like, the star is the IP, right? Whether the IP is like, I don't know, a cartoon character or we have a celebrity. That's all we need.
Right. I think that, I mean, as I was watching, I was like thinking as a producer and thinking, I watched the whole show, and around episode, I think 3, she has the chef Roy Choi on, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, she's way more comfortable. 1, she seems more comfortable with men for whatever reason.
Yeah.
2, she seems more comfortable learning something, and I actually like her more when she's learning something instead of teaching me something that it doesn't feel like she's an expert in necessarily.
Yes.
Like that would be a better way to sort of frame the show, is like learn with Meghan or whatever. She seems more comfortable crafting. I actually liked a lot of the crafting stuff, and that happens later. Like, some of her friends, I don't know, it did feel a little like, why would you start with that first guest? Why would you start with an episode where everybody seems nervous and no one seems quite sure?
We're going to talk a lot more, too, about like the situational weirdness in terms of not shooting at her house. But let's talk about that second question about relatability.
Yes.
Because I think it is such a demand and so weird.
It is really weird. I'm really curious what you think, because as I was reading that question and as I was seeing, there's a lot of sort of reels on the internet that are talking about these contradictions, like she's wearing a X $100,000 pinky ring while she's, you know, making a balloon arch or whatever.
She's a princess.
Right, exactly. And like that contradiction shouldn't bother us. Like, we listen to rich people all day. Didn't Gwyneth Paltrow say once, like, I am who I am. I can't pretend to be making $25,000. And everyone's like, yeah, we don't want you to be making $25,000. Like, I mean, like, maybe these days this should bother us as like our government's being dismantled by like TV villains or whatever, but like she's just crafting at the end of the day. And like if you really want to make a balloon arch, like you'll find the time to make a balloon arch at any socioeconomic level.
This is not saying you should make a balloon arch every single day of your life. It's saying if you want to have a kids party that like actually is more fun for you to create than the kids will have at the party, then here is how to make the balloon arch.
Yes.
I should also correct myself. She is not a princess. She is a duchess.
And maybe was a duchess?
There are people, I don't know. There are people who get so up in arms about this stuff. I'm like, well, I don't ask you to call me Dr. Peterson. And I have a PhD. The other thing that it reminds me of is there's actually really, really fascinating scholarship about early television. So we're talking 1940s, 1950s. A lot of it was shot live. This was before television was filmed. So it was shot more like a radio show. And there was a moment in the 1940s and 50s where they're trying to figure out like, okay, so some of the stuff that we do is going to just be filmed radio shows.
Right.
And some of the stuff that we're going to do, we're going to try to use kind of washed up movie stars.
Right.
And I've done a lot of work on looking at Gloria Swanson's early television shows. She had one in the 1940s and one in the 1950s.
Amazing.
And there was this difficulty of trying to translate this understanding of larger than life movie stars. So Gloria Swanson was like the queen of silent Hollywood. She had a gold plated bathtub. Like all of that was the conversation about her during the height of her fandom in the 1920s was like, she is pure glamour and she is nothing like you, right? And that was how audiences related to her as a movie star. They had never seen her in anything other than like on a movie screen, which was larger than life.
Right.
Looking just exquisite, right? And then here she is on like a crappy TV screen. How do you try to like make yourself, like how to de-glamorize yourself for television?
Yeah, that's interesting.
While also holding on to that star appeal. This is really muddled in the years since, especially now that this, like since the streaming era, But there, up until like the 1990s, there really was this delineation between like, this is a star for television.
Right.
And this is a star for movies. And sometimes someone would transcend that, like George Clooney. But even like Jennifer Aniston, to me, she still signifies television star.
Interesting. Yes. Well, meanwhile, when we saw, I saw the Maria Callas movie, and Angelina Jolie came on stage, and I was like, that's a movie star. Maybe she's our last movie star. She just is in your head like that.
Right. And I think that Meghan is 100% a TV star.
Yeah.
Right? Like she's on Suits, which is the most TV of like a very classic TV show.
Mm-hmm.
1 billion episodes, incredibly formulaic. Something that a lot of people have returned to in part because of her, but like she's not even the main character. She is a supporting TV actress and has the glamour that is appropriate to that and to that role. But now she's a royal, even though she's not like no longer has royal duties, like she still has that glamour and that celebritization affixed to her.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very difficult for her to reconcile those two.
Yes. And it's very uncomfortable to kind of watch it. And also you kind of watch like she's referring back to different stages of her life, and her class status has sort of changed a few times in her life. She's gone from like, she grew up working class, she went to this sort of upper class but TV star sort of level, and then she became royalty. But when she refers back to her childhood or when she refers back to Suits, something feels disjointed about it.
Is it the third episode where she's talking about like how LA she is? Like, I'm an LA kid.
Yeah.
And that's part of her and part of how she, I think, conceives of herself. But then you like contrast that with the episode before when Mindy Kaling's like, where are your clothes from?
Right.
Which is so interesting to me. I'm like, her clothes are like, you know, even if there are moderate pieces, like they're all rich people clothes.
Right.
And she had like, why, as an editor, you're like, oh, we want her to say, because she says, I'm very high-low. And she's like, my pants are from Zara, but then her sweater is from Jenny Kane. And I think a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, who can afford that? I'm like, a royal can afford that. But I do think that this demand that she be relatable really stems from that original balance of her image, which is as a television star.
That's really interesting. Yes.
So,
yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And when you're watching, you just, it feels like there's nowhere where she lands that feels quite comfortable.
Yeah.
And that it's a hard problem that was not solved.
I also want to talk about what you mentioned, which is that sometimes she sounds like an AI. You picked out a clip at the very end of the last episode.
Oh,
that
yeah.
demonstrates some of this. Let's roll that tape and then talk about it.
All right, great.
Just being home and connecting with friends, making new friends.
We did it.
Thank you. I'm just so grateful for that. But also reconnecting with myself.
And just learning, right? Like, I've always been curious.
Sharing all of those discoveries and everything I love with the people that I love, it just brings me so much joy.
To love.
To love.
Can't end on a better note than that.
I'm just watching your face while you're watching it.
I feel like I have so much to say and I don't know where to start. But I want.
Okay, you start, and then I'll tell you some of my feelings while I was watching it.
Oh, man. Okay. I guess, the show shouldn't be that complicated. Like, it is a simple lifestyle show, an Ina Garten, a Martha Stewart. Like, it has the fake guests and the fake prepping for little stage dinners. And, like, that should all be fine. I feel sort of like we're used to suspending disbelief to a degree for a template where, like, not everything really happens that way, and they're not this happy all the time, and, like, they always seem perfect, but it's fine. And, like, that's not a problem for us. We're, like, comfortable swallowing that. But with this, something feels, like, painful and profoundly missing, and it's easy to say it's, like, soul or humility or something. But that's not all it is. And it does just kind of, there's something that feels sort of AI generated about it, partially because there's just like all these sort of, I don't know, she'll say things like, oh my God, I love hearing the meaningful stories behind things. And you're like, but what does that mean? Or like, it's just about joy. And you're like, but what does that mean? And these are all true statements, but there's just no tension. I don't know. There's nothing that it's rubbing up against. It feels bizarrely empty.
I can also tell you, like, as an audio editor, that little clip is from like 10 different
Yes.
interviews.
Yeah. No, and I
It's
remarked
just sound bites.
I remarked during the
Yes.
show itself, not during that part, but other parts during that first episode specifically, that the Foley, and that's when you like have to go in and do like pickups essentially. Like you have to add in commentary. And once you notice where Foleys are, both in the audio, but then also the fact that like most of the time if someone's adding in a Foley, there's no image of the person talking.
Right. They're not facing camera or
Yeah,
there's a B-roll.
It's all over the place.
It's everywhere.
And I think especially for the first episode, that was like notes from on top, right?
Mhm.
Being like, we need to know what this is about. And I think like that last scene, what we just heard, happens at the end of an episode where they've like made this food together and then they go out into this vista that also looks like AI.
Yeah, that's
She's like,
true.
it's not a green screen, but it looks and part of like they're evoking it's not a green screen. And one of the reasons they're saying that, I feel like subconsciously or consciously, is because Netflix has become notorious for shooting with green screens.
Yeah.
Instead of location.
Yeah. That quote comes at the end of the entire show. It's like not a spoiler because it doesn't say anything, but it comes at the end of the entire show and then refers back to some of the parts right at the end of that first episode where she says it's not a green screen. So it does feel like it's already happened. And it sounds like it feels like you'd actually seen it when really it was on episode 8. But it's like that's another example of just sort of like you could watch an episode and feel that you had watched it because it all feels sort of the same.
Wait, so it's not at the end of episode 1? Is that what you're saying?
No, that quote is from the end of the last episode.
Oh, no, I think
Of
she
the
says it
show.
at the end of episode 1, too. This isn't a green
Oh.
screen. Yeah.
Then she's done it twice.
And I think that and then they like cheers to love, and I was like, why are you cheering to like why are you cheersing to that? Like they didn't talk about love at all. And then I was like, oh, it's the name of the show.
Yeah.
If I were an essay editor and this was an essay, I'd be like, there are too many strands in this essay. Like let's go back to the beginning and figure out what this show is about. And I think that also makes me think about something that Hunter Harris and Allie Jones brought up in their back and forth about the show, which we'll link to in the show notes, which is that we have to like position this as one of the very few things that have come out of blockbuster production deals that Meghan and Harry signed with Netflix and with Spotify. This happened several years ago and nothing has really emerged. And that this is also a show that is functioning as a sort of rebranding after they launched this jam company that then they had to rename because they hadn't checked to see if anyone else had the copyright already. Like it was just fumbled in a way that is very curious. And so to me, like if you know that backstory, that they had tried to come up with a concept for a show for a long time, then it makes sort of the Frankenstein element of it make a little bit more sense.
Yes. As an editor, you watch it and you're like, this is a mess. And it makes sense because actually I don't think it is clear in that they didn't really know what it was going to be until after they filmed.
Yes.
Maybe.
No, and that's the thing is that you should never, it makes sense when the pilot doesn't necessarily know what it's doing or is kind of back edited to make it make sense with what they've decided the theme of the show is. But then it also doesn't totally make sense as the show goes on either. So,
yes.
Today's episode is sponsored by Ollie. All right, so my dog Steve does this like sound only early in the morning when it's time for food. And it goes something like this. This is going to be embarrassing, but are you ready? It goes, it's like undulating. This is going to sound corny, but we started giving him Ollie with his food, like mixing in the Ollie wet food with his dry food. And now the is like even louder and more extended because he's so excited for it. How does Polly feel about Ollie?
Polly is she's not a picky eater, but she gets bored really easily. So she will go on hunger strikes, but she'll cry because she's so hungry while there's kibble in her bowl. So we started mixing in a little bit of the Ollie, and now she's literally licking the bowl clean.
As you've said, all of our dogs, all of whom are rescues, have forgotten that Every single one of them was born in a ditch.
They have forgotten where they came from.
Ollie is fresh. It's a whole food diet. Like on the front of each one of them, it says the different ingredients. The one I fed last night was, I think, like turkey and blueberries. Ollie delivers clean, fresh nutrition in 5 drool-worthy flavors. And you don't need to be a veterinary nutritionist to know that real, minimally processed food is the best choice for your dog's health. It's made in U.S. kitchens with high-quality human-grade ingredients, and it contains no fillers, no preservatives, just real food. You can tell by the size of your dog's poop. Did you know that? How much filler there is?
Yes.
If there's a lot of filler, there's a lot of poop. And there has not been more poop.
Yeah,
and
can confirm.
It is gently cooked and delivered fresh. It's delivered in these like big frozen boxes, and then you can take it out of your freezer and it defrosts in a day. And then when you open it, it doesn't smell weird. There's not like any weird artificial shelf life extender. Like it's really nice. So there's recipes like fresh beef and sweet potatoes, fresh turkey with blueberries that I mentioned, fresh lamb with cranberries. You might think, my dog eats better than I do. This is actually true. I think yesterday my dog did eat better than I do.
I was like kind of tempted to take a taste. I'm not going to lie. I didn't do it, but I could see somebody
opened it up. We opened it up and Charlie was like, if I needed to, I bet I could eat that.
Which I've never thought about the kibble.
If you want to try it out, you go to Ollie's website and you do this really quick quiz, and it will create a customized meal plan that's related to like your dog's weight, whether they need to gain or lose weight, their activity level, all of their other health info. And then they put together the numbers and they recommend like what they would give and like the daily portions and if you want to mix it, all that sort of thing. And then you get this welcome kit for first timers, and it's 2 weeks worth of meals and then a guide on how to gradually switch them over to the new diet. Ollie is also the only fresh dog food that comes with unlimited routine health screenings, so you can get your pup on track to living their healthiest, happiest life. Dogs deserve the best, and that means fresh, healthy food. Head to ollie.com/culture. Tell them all about your dog and use the code CULTURE to get 60% off your welcome kit when you subscribe today. Plus, they offer a clean bowl guarantee on the first box, so if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. That's OLLIE.com/culture and enter code CULTURE to get 60% off your first box. And make sure you do that if you want to try it out, because this is a great way to show that you support the show by showing Ollie that you are a Culture Study listener and you heard about them here. Okay, next question comes from Lori.
Do you think that having critics watch all 8 episodes at once contributed to all of the negative responses to her show? I admit the first episode wasn't amazing, but I find that it's a soothing show when watched slowly while folding laundry or organizing. How does the current critique of this show compare to shows like Selena and Chef, Marie Kondo, or Down to Earth with Zac Efron?
In light of this question, I put this on in the background while I was doing all of my morning tasks, and that's how I watched episode 4 and the first half of 5. And it was soothing. And, you know, a lot, like, that's one thing we have to remember. A lot of these shows, and I would include, like, the Martha Stewart show or, like, Rachel Ray, like, a lot of these kind of lifestyle-y shows were intended as daytime television that people who were home during the day would watch somewhat ambiently. Right? Like soap operas, same thing. There's a lot of narrative redundancy so that if you have to leave to go change the laundry, then you can come back and you're like, I still get it. Right.
Right. Correct.
And so I do think that that is maybe contributing to some of the critique of the show. Like it's not meant to be watched as like, oh, here is a really enthralling narrative at 9 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
I agree that it is soothing. My colleague, Rebecca Rose, actually watched this with her 12-year-old son. And he is like blissfully, you know, free of any historical judgment about this person. And she said that his reaction was basically like, I don't see what the problem is. She looks great. Her house looks great. It's fun to watch. Like, I learned how to make bath salts. He said it was like relaxing.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. If I wasn't so worked up about, if I wasn't sort of like cringing so often, I would, I did find actually often I would be like, oh, that's like a really good tip for flower arranging. Or like, I want to make saltfish. Or like, I'd be like, oh God, why did she say that? And then I'd be like, chili oil. That sounds fun.
Pickling really is easy. You can pickle a strawberry. I do think it's weird that she's like, I didn't know. Like, there's so many things that she didn't know.
Really should have known.
And
or just don't say you didn't know.
Yeah. And that actually, it reminds me of the mode is more like a morning show where an expert chef comes on and teaches the host how to do something.
Yeah, but then but it fluctuates because sometimes she's like, I know this and I'm going to teach it to you because I am a crepe expert, or like, I am a flower arranging expert, or like, this is why, let me just add a little bit of lemon. You'd be shocked to know that it just brightens the whole dish. And, and then other times, in an effort maybe to be relatable, which I think is good, admit when you don't know things. Like, it's great to say like, yeah, I actually have never pickled but because it's juxtaposed with I do know so often, I don't know, it's just confused. Meanwhile, Selena Gomez's whole show is about not knowing.
Yes.
Like, at least it's a clear premise.
Yeah. I also think that every time she brings up something from her own life in an attempt to be relatable, that it immediately sends your mind thinking about her celebrity text, right? So, like, she talks about how, like, oh, in my house, like, I make everything for my family every breakfast, right? And I'm like, interesting. And I'm just like picturing it. Or she's like, my husband, she never says Harry. She's like, my husband immediately puts salt on anything without even tasting it. And I'm like, a fellow salt pig just like me. And it just like evokes that big, like,
it's really true.
The very large shadow of her royal family. Whereas, like, I don't know, when Oprah talks about Stedman, you're like, oh, Stedman. Like, he's just almost like, it's like a prop, right? Or like when Martha talked about her husband, like, it's a prop.
Right, yes. I also, this question made me go back and watch some of Selena Gomez's show. And I looked back at some of the critical reviews of both of those shows. And they were both mostly just called, like, I think New York Magazine called them utterly random. There was just like an energy to the critical response that was just like, they're famous, let them. What's the big deal?
Yeah.
Whereas like the critical reception to this is like, the stakes are high. Everybody's obsessed and wants to know about this woman. And so it's that different in that way. But it did make me wonder, like, actually, and I'm curious what you think, like, why do we want to keep watching her and this show? Like, why is this show still so popular, even if people are don't like her or whatever? Like, is it because she's a royal and the storyline is irresistible and we're doing what you say? We're, like, thinking of her in her home and there's something about that that's sort of, like, candy or tasty in some way? Is it because she's, like, actually profoundly watchable, even if people find her cringy? Like, or is it just because she's really pretty? What is it?
I think it's the promise of revelation. People want to know more. And the reason that they've been led to believe that they would get more is the Oprah interview and Harry's book.
Yes.
Because I think sometimes people are like, well, she has a right to privacy. And I'm like, well, yes, of course she does. But then also she has strategically used revelations as a way to establish this brand, right?
Yes.
And so I think that part of the dissatisfaction with this show is that people want a certain level of authentic disclosure.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand her reticence to provide it, but the precedent was set. Does that make sense?
Totally. Exactly. Like, you chose to do a television show.
Well, and if she hadn't provided those disclosures before, then I think people would be like, oh, she's an incredibly private person.
Right.
Who's not going to talk about this and who is going to say only my husband and not Harry on the show.
Mm-hmm.
But there have been these previous attempts to say, like, this is what really happened. This is what is really happening. This is the way that we want to engage as celebrities with the institution of the royal family. Like, we want to speak truth to power in that way.
Right.
And then that's not happening with this show.
Totally.
And it, like, a cooking show shouldn't do that. Like, we should,
right.
But again, like, that's the unfair expectation that I think is levied on her.
Yes. You know, that reminds me of Vulture had a sort of scathing review of the show, and the end was really, interesting is it's Catherine von Arendonk, and she said that Meghan comes off, in short, like a member of the British royal family, afraid of showing vulnerability, obsessed with appearances, and seeking affirmation from a public she cannot be part of. Nothing could be weirder or more depressing.
Yes.
And that's true, because she's promised us the opposite. That feels even worse somehow.
Right. I
feel better.
I felt that throughout. I'm like, oh, this is this is very like British, like having a tea time for your kids, like there are these
right, totally
kind of interesting connections that like go back to royalty. I wonder if that was like executive producers who were like, what if we did a tea time with your kids and Mindy Kaling's kids? Like
in a California way, right?
Okay, I think that gets to some of what we're talking about with like the 8 episodes. And I do think that like some of this is being judged harshly in comparison simply because of her celebrity, and not on its merits. But then some of it is actually about the show itself. Our next question, we have 2 of them. We're combining them. We'll read them both and then we will discuss. This first one is from Daisy.
I feel like there's some dissonance in Meghan Sussex's brand, that it's trying to covertly repackage the English garden cottage homestead lifestyle, but in Montecito on the show. But it hasn't quite landed with as much contrast as it needs to feel like interesting or new or aspirational. Like it's like the departure away from English life doesn't feel far enough away to be like new or news. Discuss.
And then the next one comes from Anne.
I noticed all the cookware is new. Meghan even talks about breaking in the blender and specifically says, "This isn't my house." Part of why I enjoy home entertainment shows like these is to feel like a voyeur in the host's home, being fed the illusion that her everyday routine involves baking dog biscuits and preparing spa towels. How am I supposed to relate to the show when I'm being implicitly and explicitly told it's just for show?
So I think both of these questions arrive at the sort of tone jumble of the show.
Yes.
So first of all, can I just admit that I was like, I turned to Charlie, who I had watched the first episode with me, and I was like, isn't Montecito in like Southern California? He's like, no, it's like in the beautiful part of like near the bay. I was like, they never locate us. Like where are
That's
we?
so true.
Where
That's really
are
very
we?
true. Yes.
And all we know is that there's this green screen and that she's able to grow lots of berries. Yeah, I don't know enough about California to like have known that, and they're assuming a lot, and I think that also leads to some of the difficulty. But the fact that like it's not their home, and maybe we would have assumed that, but then they call out that it's not their home, or they call out that the blender is new. That it would be one thing if they're like, "Hey, we're in this test kitchen. Like, isn't this weird?" So it's not funny. Yeah. It's just odd.
Yes, that's right. I think they went like half the way.
Yes.
And it didn't satisfy either side. It's like, my sense is that it felt like they were actually doing something a little bit different by like acknowledging, like, we're going to say like, it's not my house. We have a crew here. We're breaking the fourth wall. Like, we're cool. We're real. You know what I mean? Like, I need privacy. A lot of weird shit just happened to me. And, like, I don't want people in my house. If she just kept talking and said that, I would feel so relieved. Like, if she just went all the way, then I would feel like she was a real person. And I think you're right that, like, there are times in the press where she has sounded like a real person. Yeah. And so she just, I don't think she ever really gets there on the show. Maybe like 2 times, maybe once she's playing mahjong, maybe once with Roy Choi, but really she really holds herself back from getting there, so you get kind of stuck in the middle, and it's not in a good place to be.
So at the beginning of the second episode, she walks in and she's like, I was up so late last night, or like I was up early because I was like, what am I going to make for Mindy Kaling?
Right, exactly.
Like,
you thought about that. Give us a break.
And then she's like, oh, but you're here, DP. I need to make you coffee. And so it becomes this thing about like, I'm the consummate hostess.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of interesting, right? Like, okay,
yes.
She cannot turn off hostess mode. And I would love to hear her like talk a little bit about that. Like, sometimes I'm exhausted. Like, sometimes it's difficult to feel like you always have to be making bath salts. Like,
yes, yeah.
All of that.
Yeah.
And again, that would be if she was leaning more into the relatable.
Right.
But if she was leaning it more into the Martha unrelatable, don't talk about how you woke up in the middle of the night. Like, you know exactly what you are making. Like, you are an assured hostess who always has their shit under control.
Yes, absolutely. I felt that way also. There's this huge conflict. There's this like kind of theme throughout the show that we're not in pursuit of perfection.
Yes.
And so she sort of like has a perfect piece of paper and she makes and she's saying, you know, we're not in pursuit of perfection. We're just trying to make something look cute. But then she uses pencil lines to create perfect lines so that she never goes outside the line. And you're watching the whole thing and you're thinking like, you are in pursuit of perfection. You do seem very preoccupied with perfection. And you seem pretty like wound tight in some ways. And I don't mean that as a criticism. Like, there are a lot of people in this world who are watching who also are the way you are.
I mean that
and
as
take
relatable.
Great pleasure.
Like, that's
yeah,
relatable.
And take great pleasure of watching that. Yes, and it would be like infinitely more interesting if you just acknowledged this like very human conflict. Yeah, and it doesn't get there. And I do feel that. And I actually wanted to ask you, like, you know, as the show is sort of stuck in a number of things, it starts to feel dated, right? Like, it's not exactly a cooking lifestyle show. It's not exactly a morning show. It does feel a bit like Daisy said, like a BBC English country show, but it's not that. It does feel a little like aspirational content creator, Instagram reel, TIG influencer thing.
Yeah.
But it's not quite that either. And then there is a little bit of tradwife in it. Like, she really does very specifically gender hosting as hostessing as a verb. And I found that really interesting, and I wanted to ask you.
You know, there's this clip where she corrects Mindy Kaling about, like, it's Sussex now. That's very, like, it's gone all over the place. And I think a lot of people are using that as, like, first evidence that she's not that close with Mindy Kaling. But second evidence that, like, there is some confusion, maybe is not the right word, but maybe evokes what I'm trying to say here in terms of how she wants to relate to her royalness. But to me, it also, she then, the next part of it is she's like, it's so important to me to have the same last name as my kids.
Right.
For us all to have this name as a family.
Which feels very outdated. I mean, fine. It's a fine decision. It's totally fine. But it's not like a complex thought. It's like not a original thought. It's like actually the most traditional thought.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And this is also, I think, one of the fascinating things about being a celebrity who is also talking about their domesticity. And this reminds me of a lot of discourse from, like, old Hollywood, too, or even, like, Marilyn Monroe, about how they were such good hostesses. And I think a lot of it is trying to get at this complex anxiety about the fact that they're actually working women.
Yeah.
A Hollywood movie star is a working woman outside of the home. So how do you quell, like, the panic over a powerful woman who makes her own money? Is you emphasize, like, how good they are at making steak and how much time that they spend at doing this whole second job of being a good hostess. And so, like, here we have Meghan doing the job of being on a television show and someone who has always had a job, who's also talking about how she has, like, all of this time to do all of these other things.
Right.
And I think that's part of the old-fashionedness too, right? Or like the outdatedness of the show is this idea that, like, a woman should have a full-time job out of the home and then also have the time to make 150 jars of jam.
Totally.
And yes, she probably, I don't know about her domestic help, and I don't know how much she spends of her days doing other jobs, but just the idea that is forwarded by this show is of, you should do it all.
Yes, totally. And I think maybe actually it feels sort of like a disloyalty to a lot of people who've been following her story who like originally thought of her as someone who was like breaking a lot of traditions, who was like bringing like a black woman American coming into the royal family and like maybe modernizing it, like somebody who might come in and modernize a lot of very outdated traditional things, then comes out with a show that's like extremely outdated and traditional in many ways.
And, like, the attraction to it is the same as why people follow these, homesteading accounts. Like, I understand why that idea is alluring. But we can also talk about why that is alluring. The last thing I'll say about perfection is there's this great moment in the first episode when she's making the cake with her makeup artist, and they're like, and he's like, I don't know how to put the frosting on, and she's like, it's fine, like this is sloppy, we're just doing it, right? Like invoking that we're not dedicated to perfection. And then the camera cuts away, and then it comes back, and right before they cut the cake, like it's very clear that they cleaned up the lines of the frosting. So it's like, it's totally cool to be messy, but not for this next shot.
Right, exactly. Yeah, totally. There's also a moment later in episode 7, she's with her friend Vicky, who's Taiwanese, and they're talking about this term, kintsugi. It's like golden repair. It's like when you repair broken pottery with gold, and they talk about how like perfect isn't beautiful, and stop trying to be perfect, and you know the cracks and the imperfections like make you more interesting and more beautiful. And Meghan is like very earnest, obviously, in that moment. It's like exactly the theme of her show and of her that she wants to portray, and she's like kind of almost about to cry, and we are all, of course, thinking about her royal family escape and all that stuff, and then everything around her is perfect. I think that's the just like, and then you look around the kitchen and you're like, but it's all perfect.
And also, she wears white like 80% of the time.
Bell sleeves to cook. Very impractical. Anyway,
I think Hunter Harris brought this up in that. What would have been really interesting is like, what if you intercut this with some footage of her actually doing the stuff in her home that like Harry shot on his iPhone?
Yeah.
Like if you wanted to get at that sort of like messily imperfect stuff, you need to have stuff that is not shot with perfect lighting on what amounts to be a set, right?
Totally.
And I think that they didn't think through or didn't want to offer that sort of intimacy, but still want to claim it rhetorically.
Yes. Yeah. And I feel so much better. I feel like it's all coming into shape, you know, when you don't know why something is wrong.
Yes,
and then you start to like get it. Yeah, feels good.
Okay, so last question is, I think, about, is there any way that this could actually be right, or like...
Yeah.
Basically, like, a comparison of her and also the final boss of aspirational lifestyle content. So this one comes from Michelle.
I recently watched the Martha Stewart documentary, and I found by the end that I still don't like her. Quite possibly, I actually like her even less. But I found that I do now admire her in a way that I hadn't before, because I realized that, first of all, her business opportunities were limited by her gender. And secondly, I realized that she became a target for resentment in ways that men with her kind of power and privilege never would have faced, which turned her story into kind of like a lessons in chemistry plotline, but for the very rich. Can any of this help us understand and approach Meghan and her show differently? I'm desperately tired of celebrities getting attention and money when far more qualified and interesting regular people deserve it, for podcasts, books, TV shows, clothing lines, etc. But I'm also looking for a way, maybe, to see how and if gender intersects with class in this situation to complicate it, and maybe change our perspective on it.
And race, for sure, right?
For sure.
You've watched the Martha documentary, I'm sure.
I have, yes. Yeah. I love this question, too.
Also, I have to say, Martha documentary, another jumble of tone.
That's true.
A perfect first half and a mess of a second half.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because Martha was willing to be very intimate and observational about the first half of her life, and not willing. Basically, after the rest, she's like...
Yes, she doesn't want
to go there. Or maybe hasn't processed it yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do appreciate how this question underlines the ways that, like, it's just, like, all of this is a shit show.
Yeah.
No one's asking Harry to do this fucking show. You know? Like, this is, they need to make money. And I guess Harry did his book. He's like, I did my work, right?
Yeah.
And I would actually argue that this show is a lot more work than Harry writing that book.
Yes, definitely. I would agree.
So,
I mean, he had a ghostwriter. He just told a guy about his life.
Yeah. He just, like, someone showed up to his house every Sunday, and he talked to him for 2 hours.
And
then
maybe
the
it was
person
hard sometimes to, like, get into it, but that's kind of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he had to like deal with the fallout from it. Absolutely.
That's
but
true.
that was something that they were dealing with together.
Mm-hmm.
Harry's not getting criticized for this show.
That's true. Very true.
And also, like, I think simply because of Meghan's identity, like because she is not British, because she is Black, because she doesn't come from like a royal tradition, because she's always compared to Kate.
Mm-hmm.
She's always climbing uphill.
Yes.
So how do you film a reality show with a kind of shitty streamer while marching uphill? Like, she's carrying so much on her back
I know.
to try to make this work. And I think Netflix is the closest approximation that we have now to like network television. So a lot of people are watching this and critiquing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think?
I totally agree. One line that I took from the Martha documentary that I still think about all the time is I think there was a lawyer. One of the talking heads was basically like, being a bitch actually isn't a crime. Like, she got like basically convicted for being a bitch, and like actually that's not a crime.
Totally.
And I think that all the time. Like, being a bitch isn't a crime, guys. I just remember it all the time, and I thought that when I was watching the show, like, she comes off as a little annoying, but like being annoying isn't a crime, and like being annoying, like, she's annoying in the way that like no one's trying to be annoying, and she's annoying in a way that like I know a lot of people that are, and it's fine. Like, I still like a lot of them. I don't know. It felt like that
Can you
is
imagine
very.
if we tried to do this show,
Oh
how
my
annoying
God.
we would be? Like,
Yes.
weird things that we would say on camera trying to be casual. Like, someone was ripping her, and I now I see this all over the place about how like all of her phrases are like very elder millennial. Like, she's like, my bacon brings all the boys to the yard.
Totally. A lot of bad
like
puns.
and first coffee. Like stuff like that. And I'm like, oh, I would say such weird stuff on camera.
Totally. And also, like, it is pretty hard to be yourself in public. Like, even when I'm on mic, I have to remind myself, like, don't try to be an on-air version of yourself. Like, there's an audience, but like be yourself version of yourself, and like don't fall into robot brain and all that stuff. My partner and I think of it as like robot brain versus human brain, like stay in human brain.
Yes.
So I do think that's like obviously a major double standard. And, I'm sure you've gotten emails. I've certainly gotten emails about the amount I say like, or or just like tone ticks in my voice that bother people.
Yes, we are so bothersome. And it's just
we're
like
bothersome.
just talking in a public forum as women. And here she is talking, appearing, trying to both like be an expert, but also be a novice.
Right.
Which a lot of us actually are good at some things and don't know anything about other things. Like, it
true.
should be relatable. But I think in part because we want women to fall into one of two boxes, right? Like, either you are the final boss, like Martha. I even said this earlier in the show. I want her to either be final boss or I want her to not know anything, like Selena Gomez.
Yes, I felt that way too. I want her to be an expert or not. It did really bother me that she was fluctuating between those things. Yeah, but maybe that's fine. I don't know.
This is where we have to go back to the fact that, like, this isn't a good TV show.
Right.
Because you need to know who your character is.
Yeah.
And so even if Meghan herself is somewhere in between those things, that's not a good character.
Yeah.
You can't write a narrative around it.
That's totally true. It reminds me of like with any piece, like you kind of like you print it out and you read it, and then you try to read it like without putting, I mean, I do at least try to read it without putting any marks on it, and then go back to the top and think like, okay, what is this about?
Yeah. Yes, totally.
And it just felt like that didn't happen.
And usually you write your way into it by the end of the piece. I feel like if
Yes.
you like, I kind of know what the show that they wanted to make is, or that maybe that Meghan wanted to make.
Mm-hmm.
Even on episode 4, I get more of a sense of it. But it's not the show that the show thinks that it is.
Yeah, yeah. I will say, though, like, there's something, I'm curious what will happen in season 2, because if they can somehow turn it around and do it right, like, there are a lot of really interesting elements to her and to her story, and, like, there are a lot of things intersecting all at the same time. Like, there's her gender and her life experience and her sort of what we were talking about, like, she's been a member of different social classes and she's biracial and Black, and her mother's African American, which is also like it's a race and a culture, and she's Californian, and that's an interesting culture. And she went to the UK, and her husband is like very stodgy white British. Like that's an interesting. Anyway, there are a lot of strands there, and a good show can let a person be many things at once. Like, I think we all know that we are all many things at once and, like, crave seeing that on TV, and, like, the best TV or the best films, like, remind us of that. It just didn't do it right.
She has led a really interesting life full of a lot of good stuff and a lot of bad stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the show, as is, zippers her into, like, this bodysuit of blandness.
Totally.
That I don't think is true to her experience. And maybe she is doing that in part to herself out of safety, and I understand that, but also that doesn't mean that it makes it a good show.
Yes, yeah.
Can we end this show, with the part of the show that formally, in terms of form and style, bugged us the most? Because we have it. There's one thing that we have not talked about that I really want to talk about. Dave, I can go first if you want me to.
Okay, mine's very niche. That it's like very specific to me. So
mine is the annoying ass music that uses like words that they've said and then finds a song that uses the music. Like, and they just were making dip and they played like "When I Dip, You Dip, We Dip," right? That's like. It's so amateur. Or like someone says like happy. Like there's a lot of doo-wop in the show, or like, but like that's not all that they use. Like you can if that's your vibe, like, oh, we're only gonna have like Motown 50s and 60s music. Cool. But don't use words that someone has just said and then like use that at like then like Google search like what's a song that uses that word? And then also have "When I Dip, You Dip, We Dip." Like it's so it's like it's just not savvy. It's like the sign to me of either a really bad music director or a non-existent one.
Yes,
so
the music is really bad. It was in my notes too. Music bad. I totally agree. It just felt like kind of budget in a weird way. Man, I got a lot. I mean, there's a lot of little things like the music, the not knowing which gardens were her gardens, kind of like, I don't know. I loved at the very end, Alice Waters was on. She's an icon, like very wonderful to have her, but they put her on the show she's sort of like the founder of the, farm to table movement. And they put her on the show ostensibly to help Meghan throw a party, but then she wasn't invited to the party. And like, that was terrible. Like, why would you not invite like the founder, whatever, like an icon of food to this party? But the thing that upset me the most was in episode 7, she's with her friend Vicky. I found it the most interesting episode. She's her friend who's Taiwanese, and she's teaching Meghan her recipe for her mother's Taiwanese pot stickers. And again, like, all up my alley. How do you sort of like pass stories down? How do you pass tradition down through recipes and food? What an opportunity. She says, okay, read me the recipe. Vicky is reading her the recipe. One of the ingredients is fajita seasoning in a Taiwanese pot sticker recipe. And Meghan is looking through like looking as if like, I don't think I have that. And she says like, fajita seasoning. And Vicky goes, well, my mother is from Texas. And then they both laugh. And then that was it. And I was like, please, dear God, a chance for an interesting conversation. Like, yes. Why not go deeper? Like, your mother is making Taiwanese pot stickers with Texan fajita seasoning. Like, please tell me, like, one more sentence. And it was sort of the epitome
we couldn't find this seasoning where she grew up. Or, like, like, there's so many interesting things you could say there. Mm-hmm. It's like, my mother is from Texas.
Yeah. There was just this sort of endless, like, you're, like, sitting with her and her Argentinian friend, and you're drinking mate, and you, like, don't learn the one deeper thing about mate. You learn, like, about mate. You learn like the sort of like what's on the AI generated when you Google what is mate. You learn that, and that's it. And like just that like that refusal to go one step further into like one interesting thing. That drove me nuts.
Okay, then on a higher note, can we talk about one thing that we liked?
Oh yeah.
So one of my favorites was actually from the pilot when her makeup artist, why can't I remember his name? I liked him as a character because he's like, this is weird. Like you could tell like he thought the entire thing was weird. And there's a moment where he says like, I'm not going to stay here. He's like, I want to go back to your cottage, like my cottage. Like, and so you learn like, oh, there's a guest cottage where he stays at their place.
Yeah.
And like that to me was one of the like real moments of intimacy.
Yes.
When he's like, I know what I really get to experience when I come to visit you.
Yes. Relatedly, she has her mahjong friends come over, and there's this one woman who comes in first, and she's kind of the only woman, seems like an actual friend, who like, she's like, well, I think that we can all make our own margaritas and whatever. And most people are like, oh my God, Meghan Markle, you're an amazing hostess. How do you do it all? Oh my God. And she's like, oh, thank you, thanks. But this woman is kind of like, sounds good, cool. Like there's just kind of like a, I'm not, that's just kind of like a, oh yeah, like this girl on our mahjong team is like such a lush. She gets drunk so quick. Like there's just an actual, you're right, an intimacy. The intimacy is good.
Yeah, I think those moments of actual intimacy were my favorite. And I don't know how you get those except
film more.
Film more.
Have a different director.
Guess.
I know.
Yeah. Let people talk more.
Yeah. My actual, like, sort of highlights of the show are some of the things that they did. I actually found them helpful. Like, I do want to make salt fish. I want to crust a whole fish with salt. I think that looks great. Like, she helped me with flour arranging. I, like, kind of want to use some of those tips. Like, I don't know, Alice Waters crushed the garlic in her vinaigrette with salt. I don't crush the garlic in my vinaigrette. That's a great idea. Like, some of the crafts are like, good. I want to make a candle. I don't mind.
Yeah, I was like, I can make a candle now, but she's like, what temperature do we put? Like she's like, how does this work? How do we make candles? I'm like, have you never gone to summer camp? Maybe not. Right. All right. If people want to hear more from you, where can they find you right now?
Oh, yeah. I wish I didn't have to say just Instagram, but for now, Instagram is a great place to find me.
But your Instagram is fantastic, so
Thank you.
It is a great place for people to find you.
I do try to be a real human on Instagram and actually post what I'm thinking and not just things that look pretty. And culture stuff and a lot of city stuff. I live in New York and we cover a bunch of cities, so I post about that too. That's Lilah Rap, LILAHRAP. And I'm on Substack sort of unofficially. You can find me there. And that's it.
Thank you so much for joining us for this complicated, weird conversation. I feel like this episode's kind of a Frankenstein, sort of like the show, so it makes sense.
I think we really touched on basically everything we could have, and I can sleep tonight.
All right. Thank you so much. This has been great.
And this is such a delight. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Today, paid subscribers got a bonus Ask Ann Anything segment featuring a conversation between me and Melody about how to show up for your friends in hard times beyond dropping off a casserole or sending a DoorDash gift card. If you want to be sure you always get the full episode, head to culturestudypod.substack.com and become a paid subscriber. You'll also get ad-free episodes and access to the weekly discussion thread. You can subscribe to the Culture Study Podcast wherever you listen. We have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. And if you want to suggest a topic or ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only Advice Time segment, go to our Google form at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod or check the show notes for a link. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.